Good morning, faithful listeners. Grab your cup of coffee because today we'll be discussing 1 Kings chapter 3. Today's episode is a really fun one to talk about because it's almost like storytelling. So we'll get into it in just a second. But before we do, if you're looking for some delicious coffee, you got to check out 7 Weeks Coffee. Because not only do they make really great coffee, but they also support life in the womb. They recently were able to donate $500,000 to pregnancy centers across America. So they're doing really great work. They are helping vulnerable women find care after they have babies. So 7 Weeks Coffee is a great coffee brand, and I highly, highly recommend them. So my link is listed in the description of this episode. And if you click on it and order coffee from my link, 10% of your purchase will go towards pregnancy centers across America, and also another 10% will go towards P40 Ministries. So don't forget to use my link listed in the description. So 7 Weeks Coffee, the coffee brand that supports life. But another person that supports the life of babies is Solomon, which we're going to read about today in this very famous story where Solomon judges fairly between two women who are disputing over a baby. So let's get into this. I'll be reading out of the WEB as usual. This is 1 Kings 3, 16 through 28. Grab your Bible. Let's read together. Two women who were prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "O my lord, I and this woman dwell in one house. I delivered a child with her in this house. The third day after I delivered, this woman delivered also. We were together. There was no stranger with us in the house, just us two in the house. This woman's child died in the night because she lay on it. She arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while your servant slept and laid it in her bosom and laid her dead child in my bosom. When I arose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, it was dead. But when I had looked at it in the morning, behold, it was not my son, whom I bore." The other woman said, "No, but the living one is my son, and the dead one is your son." The first one said, "No, but the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son." They argued like this before the king. Then the king said, "One says, 'This is my son who lives, and your son is dead,' and the other says, 'No, but your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one.'" The king said, "Get me a sword." So they brought a sword before the king. The king said, "Divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other." Then the woman whose the living child was spoke to the king, for her heart yearned over her son. And she said, "O my lord, give her the living child, and in no way kill him." But the other said, "He shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide him." Then the king answered, "Give her the living child, and definitely do not kill him. She is his mother." All of Israel heard the judgment which the king had judged, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. I would say this is probably the most famous story of anything that Solomon has done. Pretty much everybody knows this story. I would even say that a lot of non-Christians know this story as well. They've heard it before at least. This is the evidence of God's wisdom inside of Solomon. If you remember what we talked about last week, Solomon asked God for wisdom to judge the people properly. I think Solomon was a very young man and probably felt some insecurity over his age and didn't think that he was old enough to be a proper king. So he asked God for wisdom, and God was so pleased with Solomon's request that he granted Solomon a ton of wisdom. In fact, here's what it says in verses 10 through 15 of the same chapter. "This request pleased the Lord, that Solomon had asked for this thing. God said to him, 'Because you have asked for this thing, and have not asked for yourself a long life, nor have you asked for riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice, behold, I have done according to your word. Behold, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, and after you no one will arise like you. I have also given you that which you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will be not any among all the kings like you for all your days. If you walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. So God actually blesses Solomon greatly and gives Solomon a wise and discerning heart, or an understanding and wise heart, rather, is what God says, and also gives him riches and a long life as well, as long as Solomon continues to follow in the decrees of God. That was the one stipulation that God said. So God is very pleased with Solomon, and he gives him a wise and discerning heart. And the exact verbiage that God uses here, he says, I will give you a wise and understanding heart so that there has been no one like you before you, and after you, no one will arise like you. Actually, one of the questions I had last week when reading that, I didn't talk about it on the podcast, but I decided to talk about it today. The question I had was, why would God say this if he knew that Jesus was coming into the world? Because certainly Jesus was more wise and more understanding than Solomon could ever be. So why would God say that Solomon would be the most wise person on the planet, basically? Well, after thinking about it and researching it, I realized that I was misreading what God had actually said. God never said that Solomon was going to be the most wise person on the planet. He said, there will be no one like you before you, and after you, none will arise like you. And that is in verse 12. So what God is saying to Solomon is that Solomon is going to be very unique. There has never been somebody like Solomon, and there never will be somebody like Solomon ever again. And if you think about it, Jesus was nothing like Solomon, because as we're going to see later in Solomon's life, Solomon had his heart very divided. He loved God in one sense, but he also really loved the things of the world as well. He was serving two masters. Jesus was not like that. Jesus was very different from Solomon. In fact, Jesus himself said, don't serve two masters. So Jesus was not the same as Solomon. But of course, the other way that Jesus was different from Solomon was that Jesus was God and Solomon was not. So as far as humans go, I do think that there could be an argument made that Solomon was the wisest human to have existed. But because Jesus, though he was in human flesh, was actually God, he was different from Solomon in the fact that he was actually divine, whereas Solomon was not. But moving into the story, God gives Solomon a discerning heart so that he is going to be able to judge people very well, very accurately. So immediately, Solomon gets a case. These two women who are prostitutes come and stand before the king with this very difficult case. Now, some people wonder, how were two prostitutes able to have an audience with the king? Because don't forget that prostitutes, female prostitutes, were like the scum of the earth in the days of Solomon. So how could two women who had very few rights achieve an audience with the king? Well, it's actually possible that these women had gone to judges that were obviously not the king, and those judges weren't able to properly judge the case because they really didn't know what the answer to this problem was. So these prostitutes and their case kept getting sent to different judges until it eventually made it to the king. And these judges probably told Solomon, there's a very difficult case here that we just don't know how to judge properly. And maybe in your wisdom, you can discern what is right and what is wrong between these two women. So that's one way that people think that these two women were able to have an audience with Solomon. But the other way is just that maybe Solomon was relatively kind and cared about the well-being of every citizen of Israel, including these two prostitutes. And so that's why he decided to hear their case. So these two women have a very difficult case because it's one woman's word against the other woman's word. They say, we live in this house together, and we both got pregnant right around the same time. And I delivered my baby 3 days before this girl delivered her baby. And we both had baby boys. But just recently, in the middle of the night, while we were asleep, this woman rolled over her baby and killed her baby. She suffocated him to death. And when she realized that she killed her baby, she took her dead baby, who was 3 days younger than mine, and put her dead baby in my arms while I was asleep and took my live baby out of my arms and pretended that that baby was her baby. And so when I woke up, I started trying to nurse my little baby and realized that my baby was dead, and I freaked out. But then I realized it wasn't my child at all, and that she actually had my child and was nursing my child. And so that's the woman's story. But to add to the confusion of this situation, the woman says, we were both alone that night. There was no guests staying with us. We didn't have any clients that night. It was just the two of us in this house together. So basically it was one woman's word against the other woman's, because the other woman was saying, no, that story is totally fabricated. She's the one who killed her own baby, and she's all upset because, I have my live baby and she's just jealous of me and she just wants my baby because she killed her baby. So these two women are bickering in front of Solomon, being like, no, it's actually your dead baby. No, it's your dead baby. And both women want the alive baby. Now, you might be wondering, why did the woman who killed her baby want the live baby? Well, I would guess that she didn't purposefully kill her baby. I would say that she accidentally, just out of negligence, rolled over her baby in the middle of the night and suffocated him to death. And if this baby had only been a day or two old, this woman's baby would have been very fragile in his earliest days of his life. So she suffocated him and didn't even know it out of sheer negligence for her baby. So she probably didn't purposefully try to kill her baby. But when she realized that her baby was dead, she had so much jealousy of the other woman in the house that she decided to do like a sneaky little tactic to try to pretend like the live baby was actually her baby. Now, I'm sure King Solomon was not the only person in the room listening to all this. There were probably advisors and other judges that were listening to this case. And they probably don't really know the answer to this case. I mean, who would really know the answer to that? There are two women standing there who are both prostitutes, so they're already looked down upon by pretty much everybody in the room, and they both have a story. So who's to say what story is the true story and what story is the fake story? The other thing that was confusing about this case was how close in age the two babies were to each other. They were only 3 days apart. So to every other person, these two babies would have looked pretty much identical. So that was adding to it as well. If the one woman's baby had been, a couple months older or something like that, she could have said, like, look, my baby is clearly older than this other woman's baby who was just born a few days ago, who she killed. So that was another thing that was adding some confusion to this case, was just how close in age those two babies really were. It's very hard to discern the truth in those situations. So Solomon, who has been given this wise heart from God, knows how to solve this case. So Solomon tells one of his servants to go get him a sword. And the servant's like, okay, I'll go get you a sword. And probably everybody in the room is like, what is Solomon going to do with a sword? Is he going to put both these women to death? Like, what's he going to do here? They probably think that Solomon is like going crazy or something. So Solomon brings the sword out and he's like, okay, ladies, I have a solution to your problem. He says, here's what I'll do. I will chop the alive baby in two, and I will give the bottom half to her and the top half to her. Everybody in the room was probably shocked. Can you imagine everybody's faces? They're probably like, well, this is scary because he's the king and he can technically do whatever he wants. And it's very possible that he is actually going to chop this little baby in half. So don't forget the mindset of the people in this room right now, where in their minds, the king has all the power to pretty much do whatever he wants to do. So the king could truly order this baby to be chopped in half. So when Solomon gives this decree that he's going to chop this baby in half, the woman who is actually the mother of this baby, her heart breaks, is what it says. She yearned over her son. And so she starts crying out to Solomon. She's like, no, don't kill the baby. You can just give the baby to her. I just want the baby alive. Just give my son to this woman. Whereas the other woman, who is both negligent and not very bright, and also probably scared of Solomon, she says, no, Solomon, that's great. You are very wise. You go ahead and chop the baby in half, and you give a half to each of us. If I can't have the baby, then she can't have the baby either. Now, that woman was probably truly thinking, I'm going to try to suck up to Solomon because he's probably actually going to kill this baby. And I'd rather get on Solomon's good side than win this case. And also because she was so jealous of the other woman, she was probably excited over the idea that that woman couldn't have her alive child because she didn't have an alive child. You know what? If I can't have an alive son, then you have no right to an alive son either. So she agrees with Solomon's verdict and she's like, chop the baby in half. And Solomon then knows who the true mother is. And he says, don't you dare chop that baby in half. He says, give that baby to the rightful mother, who is this woman over here who cried out for the life of her son. You give that woman that baby. And I'm sure that everybody in that room breathed a sigh of relief and they're like, oh my gosh, we don't have to witness the killing of an infant today. They're probably like, good thing Solomon is so wise. And actually, Solomon's wisdom in this case became so well known around Israel that Israel started fearing Solomon, is what it says. All of Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was with him to do justice. So God's wisdom was with Solomon, and through this case, God displayed his wisdom in Solomon to all of Israel, and this caused Israel to fear the king. I've been thinking about the idea of fearing God recently because it's going to pop up a lot in the Psalms episodes that I do on Fridays. I think a lot of people downplay what fearing God really means. And they think, oh, we just need to have an awe of God. But I think it's a little bit more than that. I think, yes, we do need to have an awe of God. But we can have an awe of something and not fear it. Does that make sense? Like, for example, we can have an awe of the life of a little baby and not fear that little baby. So it must be something more than that when we fear God. I was thinking about a meme recently from when I was back in high school. There was this popular meme that went around where it said, come out and party with us tonight. And the kid was like, no, my parents won't let me. And then the people are like, well, just sneak out then and come party with us. And then the boy was like, no, I'd prefer not to die. And I remember relating very heavily with that meme because if I had ever snuck out at night when my parents didn't know about it, if they had found out, I would have died. Like, I would have died. I wouldn't be making this podcast today. That's an exaggeration a little bit, but I would have gotten in so much trouble. And to this day, they'd still be bringing it up. That is a healthy fear of your parents. You don't do something wrong because you are afraid of the consequences of doing something wrong. And you know your parents have more power over you. I think it should be a similar kind of fear when we think about God. Yes, we should regard him as holy and as awesome. But we should fear him in the sense that he can truly do us harm if he wants to, if we break any rules. Jesus himself actually said that to his disciples. He said, you guys need to fear God. Don't fear man, who can only destroy your body, and that's all they can do to you. Fear God, because not only can he destroy your body, but he can also destroy your very soul. He can cast your soul into Gehenna, is what Jesus said to his disciples. So that's what fearing God means. Not being afraid of God, not being so scared that we can't come to God and ask him for things or anything like that, but just having a healthy fear and an understanding that he is God and that he can literally do anything and that we need to please him and we should be trying to please him. I know that was a little bit of a tangent here, but the people here, it says, feared the king. because they saw that Solomon was willing to enact justice and judgment on people. That's all Solomon has been displaying for the very first short years of his reign so far. And he's a very young king, and yet he was unafraid to both put people to death or to punish people or even to take their jobs away from them. Solomon was willing to enact justice on the people, and the people saw that, and they feared Solomon because of that, because they knew if they did something wrong, they could potentially face the consequences of that sin. Well, guys, if you enjoyed today's episode, please share it on your social media platforms and tell people that the Bible Explained podcast exists. I haven't read a review in quite a while on the Bible Explained, so let me do that now. This review is on Apple Podcasts, and it says, "So thankful for this podcast." And I'm sorry, I don't know who wrote this. Who wrote this? Ash Diaz 13. So they say, "So thankful for this podcast. My husband and I wanted to start reading our Bibles and get a better understanding of the gospel. I came across this podcast and decided to give it a try. This is the best podcast to listen to if you are looking for a breakdown of the Bible. Jen is a great narrator and takes the time to break down and explain the different verses/chapters in ways that help you understand things easier. Thank you, Jen, for this podcast." Well, thank you very much for that lovely review. That is very kind, and I'm glad that my voice doesn't irritate people. Actually, in high school, people used to make fun of my voice. They did not like it. One boy in particular told me that I have a whiny voice. And that stuck with me for a really long time, actually. But I'm glad for the most part people enjoy my voice and have been enjoying reading the Bible with me and learning right alongside me, because honestly, I have learned so much from doing this podcast. It has been a huge game changer for me as well. Faithful listeners, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your Monday. I'll see you guys tomorrow for an episode from 1 Corinthians. Happy listening, and God bless.